Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Tzadi contains 3 Mishnayos. From the beginning of the Daf until the first Mishnah, we will be discussing the dyes and the herbs that we use to make them. What is the minimum size be significant to carry on Shabbos and be in violation of this Daraisa? We'll primarily be identifying the herbs that are used. Then the next Mishnah will list various different materials and what their minimum sizes are. The Gemara will explain them one by one. We'll have another Mishnah which will list more materials. That'll take us to the end of the Perek, and we'll start the 10th Perek with its Mishnah. So let's begin the Daf. We're starting a few lines in. We had seen in the Mishnah previous that there were 4 types of herbs that were used to make the dyes. There were nut shells, pomegranate peels, and 2 flowers called satis and pua. And our Mishnah had said that the minimum amount of these to be significant is enough to make a dye to color a piece of cloth that a woman wore on her head covering. The Gemara asks right away that contradicts the size that we've seen earlier on Daf Ayin the test, where we said that the minimum amount of herbs is soaking in water and having the dye leach out of them. The minimum amount of that is enough to color a sample cloth that people use to show to their prospective cloth customers, which is the same amount that people use to wrap around a spool of thread that they are weaving with to make sure that the thread shouldn't unravel. That's a much smaller amount. So the Gemara says, yes, of course. That's because if the herbs are already steeped in the water and the dye is leaking out, so then you would use a much less significant amount. A much smaller amount is significant. You would store a much smaller amount, enough to dye a sample. If, however, all you have is the herbs, you're not going to start putting them in the water to start creating the dye if the only amount you have is enough to dye such a small piece of cloth. It would have to be enough to actually color a larger piece of cloth, which is what the women wear on their hats. Okay, the next thing on the list over there was meraglayim, that's urine. The Gemara says it has to be urine which is 40 days old. Now this is used as a soap. This is used to clean things. The machlokes here if this means up to 40 days or if it means at least 40 days. Okay, the next thing that was on the list of soaps was neser. The Gemara says that's only Alexandrian neser, not from Anpanterin. The next thing on the list was buris. The Gemara wants to know what is that. So first of all, our Yehuda says that is sand. So the Gemara says it can't be. There's a brisa that says haburis v'achol. It lists buris and sand. It's obviously not sand. The Gemara says okay, it's gufris, it's cabrisa, sulfur. The Gemara says it can't be that either because we have a brisa that lists things which are included in the halachos of Shemitah, and buris can't be included in Shemitah. Sulfur can't be included in Shemitah. Buris is on the list, and sulfur can't be included in Shemitah. It doesn't grow. It doesn't have a root. So the list, let's just read the list here. It says chalbitzin, le'inun, buris, and ahol. All these things are included in the halachas of Shemitah. So it can't be that buris is a sulfur, again, because sulfur doesn't have halachas of Shemitah. So the Gemara says, no, buris is ahala. The Gemara says, buris is ahala. I just told you the list had buris and ahala on it. It can't be the same thing. The Gemara says, yeah, there are 2 types of ahala. One is buris and one has a different name. It can be just called standard ahala. Ahala is usually identified as aloe. Okay, next on the list was a soap called kimolia. The Gemara says that's something called shluf dutz. Rashi says doesn't know what it is. And then the last thing on the list is ashlag. Shmuel says they asked all the sailors who travel around all over the world, and they tell me that this is found inside a hole in a pearl, and they poke it out with a sharp metal tool. The next Mishnah lists various materials that are significant in any amount. If one carries any amount of them in the street, he is a violation of the Daraisa of carrying on Shabbos. The Gemara will explain what they're useful for and why they're significant. The Gemara will bring a brisa that adds other things to the list, and then the Gemara will show another halacha where minimum amounts are also relevant regarding these materials. So first of all, the Mishnah says the following things are useful in any amount. Something called pilpeles, which Rashi says is pepper, but not any one that we are familiar with. Itron, which is a kind of tar. Fragrances, fragrant spices. Metal. Stones of the Mizbeach. Earth of the Mizbeach. Those are significant because they have to be stored in Geniza. They have to be put away. Worms that infect scrolls. Worms that infect Svarim. those have to be taken away, or the ones that infect wraps, because they have to be put away. The Sfarim have to be stored away. Now Rabbi Yehuda adds something which is used in the service of an avodah zarah. Since the halacha is that you're not allowed to keep any of these things in your house, even in the tiniest amount, you may not hold on to any of these, shouldn't stick to your fingers. Therefore, it's considered significant because it's asur and halacha. It's called significant, and if you carry them, you're in violation of Halachos Shabbos. So now the Gemara will begin by explaining what they're useful for. First of all, the Gemara says Peles, that is useful for bad breath. You keep it in your mouth, even the tiniest amount, it takes away the bad breath. Itron is useful for a headache that affects half your head. Now, fragrant spices, psamim. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that adds that and several other things. The brisa says somebody who has a spice that gives out a bad smell is forbidden to carry any amount of it on Shabbos because it's used to keep away ruach ra. Fragrant oils, perfumes in any amount, argamon in any amount that also had a good smell, Rashi says, and a young rose, even the tiniest leaf. Okay. Now, the Mishnah also said metal in any amount. What's that for? The Gemara says you could stick it at the end of a stick and use it to prod your cows. Now, I have a brisa discussing other halacha where these minimum amounts are significant, and as if somebody says, I promise to bring a certain amount of certain material to the Beis HaMikdash, what is the minimum amount that he needs to bring? Not quite the same, not the minimum amount that's useful, it's the minimum amount that the Beis HaMikdash has use for. So if he says he wants to bring metal, he wants to bring barzo, which is iron, so that it shouldn't be less than 1 amma long and 1 amma wide, 1 square amma. So there's two versions of the following discussion. Either the Gemara says, what's that useful for? And the Gemara answers that it is a roof tile, which was made sharp with nails in it, so that it should keep birds from sitting on the roof of the Beis HaMikdash. Or the version is the opposite, that we first say that the minimum size he should bring is a roof tile, and how big is that in 1 square amma? Okay, next the Brisa over there says that if he promises to bring a copper to the Beis HaMikdash, it has to be 1 ma'ah, equal to 1 ma'ah of silver, or according to another Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer says it has to be the size of a small fork, which is used to clean out the cups and prepare the wicks in the menorah. Okay, next thing in our Mishnah was the worms from the scroll. So Rabbi Yehuda lists a number of different worms and says these are all dangerous if you swallow them, and they each have a different name depending on what they infest. The worm of books is called mekek, the worm of silk is called the techach, the worm of grapes is called ila, the worm of figs is called feh, the worm of pomegranates is called ha. All these are dangerous if you swallow them. Now the Gemara shows us with an incident. There was a Talmud sitting in front of Rabbi Yochanan, he was eating figs, and he said, "Hey, there's a thorn in the fig." Rabbi Yochanan said, a peh has killed this guy, because he realized it wasn't a thorn, he was feeling it was a peh worm. The next Mishnah continues to list various materials. Mostly we'll be discussing seeds and locusts. So first of all, we talk about a box that a peddler has, which contains many different spices in it, and the Mishnah tells you, not about the size, but you only have 1 carbon chatas, even though you bring out many different spices, each one, which has a minimum amount. Still, because it's just one act of carrying, it's only 1 carbon chatas for carrying that out. B'shoigig. Now, seeds. So we have, first of all, we start off with seeds that you use to plant vegetables in the garden, most seeds. So we have two statements here. The Tanna Kamma says that the minimum size is less than a dried fig, slightly less than a gregaris, and Rabbi Yehuda says 5 seeds. Now it's not clear if this is a machlokas or not, because garden seeds are useful for two things. You can eat them and you can plant them. And as we saw earlier in the Gemara, in Daf Ayin Ches, something which has 2 potential uses, we go with the smaller size use for Isurei Daraisa. So the Tanna Kamma is telling you that the minimum size for use is slightly smaller than eating. The usual eating size is a dried fig, and the Tanna Kamma says the amount that you'll plant is slightly less than that. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says 5 seeds. Now the 5 seeds might be smaller than the dried fig, or might be larger, so each one could be agreeing with each other and just giving you various different ways of calculating the smaller size. 5 seeds would be the minimum amount to plant, and less than eating would, and less than a gregaris could also be a planting size, or it could be an eating size. That's machlokes are showing whether or not they're agreeing or they're arguing. Anyway, those are the 2 sizes for most seeds. Now we have a few seeds that you are high for if you take out only 2 seeds, because these seeds are particularly valuable, and those are kishuin that's squash, or pumpkins, or pol hamitzu, Egyptian beans. Now, locusts. So we have 4 things about locusts. First of all, a live locust is useful as a toy, nice thing to give your kids to play with. According to the Tanna Kama, that's only if it's a kosher locust, because you don't want to give him a non-kosher locust lest he eat it. According to Rabbi Yehuda, even a non-kosher locust. Now this, therefore, is useful in whatever size it is, because kids can play with things of any size. Now, if the locust is not alive, but it is kosher, so then it's food. And then it goes by the size used for food, which is a gregaris, a dried food. And then there's a type of locust called Tsiporis kramim, which is used to make medicine, and that's the minimum amount that people use to make the medicine, and the Gemara will explain to us what that is. Now the Gemara discusses these halachos in the Mishnah one by one, as well as adding in the halacha of various different types of fibers. So first of all, the Mishnah had said seeds. And we had various different sizes for the amount of seeds that are significant, but nobody said 1 seed. So this is in contradiction to another Mishnah that said that the minimum amount of fertilizer is enough to fertilize 1 vegetable, either 1 cabbage or 1 leek, but certainly not more. So 1 seed should be significant because it's enough to grow 1 vegetable. So the Gemara says no. Nobody's going to trouble himself to save 1 seed to plant, but if you already have a growing vegetable, then 1 is significant, and fertilizing it is a significant action. Okay. Now, the Gemara now lists the different things you may do with the pits of a date. So there are 3 potential functions. If you intend to plant them, then a minimum is 2 pits. You're not going to plant less than 2. If it's meant for feeding animals, it says enough as you need to feed a pig. Jews don't raise pigs, but you could sell pig feed to a guy, and that's 1 pit. And if you plan to use it for firewood, so that will be enough to fuel a fire to cook a kazayas worth of 1 easily cooked chicken egg. Now, for the potential use for date pits is to count things. You set aside 1 pit for each thing that you count. How many do you need for that? That's a machlokas, either 2 or 5. 2 is the minimum amount for counting things. You don't count 1. But the one who says 5 says people do not need to use pits to help them remember numbers less than 5. Okay, now we talk about a couple of different types of fibers. So, hair from the tail of a horse or a cow is, even if it's just 2 hairs, because that's used to make traps to catch birds. The spiny hairs on the back of a pig, even just 1, people use it to make rope and to sew things up. And then 2 types of fibers that come from pine trees. There's one that's from the leaves, and there's one that's made from vines that go around the trunk. That's the leaves one is 2 vines, 2 fibers, and the vine that grows around is only 1 vine. That's the minimum amount for all the things. Okay, now we go to locusts. So locusts, we had said that there is a creature called Tsiporis kramim, which people use any amount of it for. The question is, how do you use this? So Rab says, first of all, its name is Palya Biari, and Abai says this is how you use it. You find it in a palm tree which is young and only has 1 vine around it. That's where it lives, and you use it to make yourself smart and have a lot of knowledge. How do you do it? Here's what you do. First of all, you eat the right half. Take the left half, you put it inside a copper tube, seal it with 60 seals, hang it from your left arm. Trying to remember which arm, use the pasuk leiv chacham liyamine v'leiv ksil l'smayla. You have to hang it on your left arm, ksil, otherwise you'll be a fool. Okay. Now, what do you do with it? After you've done that, you learn whatever you want to learn, study whatever you want to study, know as much as you want to know, and to make sure you don't forget it, open up the tube and eat the other half of the locust, otherwise you'll forget everything. Okay, now what about live locusts? We said that's a toy. Machlokes Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda whether a non-kosher locust could be a toy or not. Tanna Kama said no, because you wouldn't give it to your child because your child might eat it. So the Gemara says, well, then you wouldn't let your child play with a kosher locust because while it's alive, if he eats it, he will be violating the Isser of Baal Tashakatsu. Even a kosher insect is forbidden to eat while it's alive, not because of Eivim Menachai, because it doesn't require Shechita, or because of Baal Tashakatsu. The Gemara brings a story where Rav was walking together with Rav Kahana, and he had a locust. He was holding his hand near his mouth, and he said, "Be careful not to hold that there, people think you're doing Baal Teshakaz. So the Gemara says, no, the Tanakhama is not afraid you're going to eat it while it's alive. The Tanakhama is afraid you're going to eat it after it dies. So the Gemara says, so then how come Rabbi Yehuda is not worried about that? Why is he thinking you're not going to eat the locust if it's a non-kosher locust after it dies? Not you, the child. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says, in a child who has a locust that dies, he's not going to eat it. He's going to be very sad, and he's going to say a hesped on it, but he's not going to eat it. This takes us to the end of the parak called Amar Rabbi Akiva, and now we get to the 10th parak of Masechet Shabbos, which is called Hamatzniya. Okay, this Mishnah, this chapter, begins by discussing somebody who carried less than the minimum amount needed to be in violation of the Isser of carrying on Shabbos. Now, as we learned earlier, if somebody considers it to be significant, even if it's less than the minimum amount that most people consider to be significant, he's still violating the Isser because he considers it to be significant. So the Mishnah says as follows: if somebody stored a very small amount of seeds, or he stored them to be used for planting, or he stored them to show to customers or to make a medicine out of, and that he saved them up for this reason, and then he carried them out to the Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos in order to use them, then he is chayef, he is violating the Isser D'Oraisa, because he stored it, so he shows that he had significance for it. Now, anybody else is not in violation of an Isser D'Oraisa because it's less than the minimum amount that applied to most people. And even this guy, if after he brought it out to Rosh Hashanah, he changed his mind, decided not to use it, and carried it back in, he's not violating any Isser for doing that, any Isser D'Oraisa for doing that, because he no longer intends to use it. Okay, so we see here from this Mishnah is that if you consider it significant, even if most people don't, you're still violating the Isser. So the Gemara asks right away, why does he have to store it to give it significance? The fact that he carried it out to the Rosh Hashanah to use it shows that he wants to give it significance. He should be chayav for that. The minimum should only apply to a person who's carrying it just for no reason. He's carrying it out in the street not to use, just because he's transporting it. But this guy, he shouldn't have to store it to be showing significance. It's enough if he carries it for a purpose. So the Gemara says you're right. The Tana means that as well. If he carries it for a purpose, he's also showing that he considers it to be significant, and he's violating the Isser D'Oraisa for it. Here we're talking about a case, the Mishnah is teaching us a case where the person stored it because he wanted to use it. Then he forgot. He doesn't know why he stored it, and now he carries it out for no reason. So it's teaching us that his original intent to use it makes it significant, and therefore he's violating the Isser D'Oraisa, even though now he has no particular use for it. That's the halacha. If at one point he showed that it was significant, and he didn't now make it insignificant, he just doesn't know what it's for, he's still violating the Isser for that. Okay, that takes us to the end of Daf Tzadi. We've just begun the 10th parak, and we will continue Be'ezras Hashem with Daf Tzadi.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.